The autumn winds of 1885 swept across the Colorado Territory with a bite that promised an early winter, carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks and the restless energy of a land still finding its identity. Mark Sullivan rode his sturdy roan mare through the golden aspen groves, checking the boundaries of his modest ranch that nestled in a valley 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Cedar Ridge. The 40-year-old former Union soldier had built his spread from nothing, clearing timber, digging wells, and constructing buildings with his own calloused hands in pursuit of the peace that had eluded him since Shiloh and Antietam. Mark's ranch was neither grand nor prosperous, just a simple log cabin, a weathered barn, and corrals that housed his small herd of cattle and handful of horses. But it was his, paid for with blood and sweat rather than inherited wealth or political connections. Here in this remote valley, he'd found something resembling the tranquility that had seemed impossible during the chaos of war and the bitter years of reconstruction that followed. As he crested the ridge that overlooked his property, Mark noticed something amiss near his barn. His horses were bunched together in the far corner of their pasture, ears pricked and attention focused on something hidden in the shadows of the building. Mark's hand instinctively moved to the Spencer rifle in his saddle scabbard, old habits from his cavalry days that had kept him alive through more close calls than he cared to remember. Dismounting carefully, Mark approached the barn with the measured caution of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on expecting trouble while hoping for the best. The late afternoon sun created deep shadows between the buildings, and Mark's eyes needed a moment to adjust before he could make out the source of his horse's unease. Huddled in the corner where two walls met, barely visible in the dim light, was a small figure wrapped in what appeared to be a torn blanket. As Mark drew closer, he realized it was a child, an Apache girl of perhaps 12 or 13 years, with the distinctive features and traditional clothing that marked her heritage. She was conscious but clearly exhausted, her dark eyes watching Mark's approach with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. The girl's condition was alarming. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and debris, and Mark could see that she'd been injured, a deep gash on her left arm that had been crudely bandaged with strips of cloth. More troubling still, she appeared to have been traveling for days without adequate food or water, her young face gaunt with hunger and marked by the telltale signs of severe dehydration. "Easy there, little one," Mark said softly, setting his rifle aside and raising both hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl studied his face intently, her intelligent eyes taking in every detail of his appearance and demeanor. Mark's fluency in Apache was limited to a few words he'd picked up during his military service, but he tried to communicate reassurance through tone and gesture rather than language. "Water?" he asked, miming the act of drinking. "Food?" The girl's response was barely a whisper, but it was in clear English. "Please, they killed my family. I have nowhere else to go." Mark's heart clenched at the girl's words, spoken with a combination of grief and dignity that seemed far too mature for someone so young. He knelt slowly beside her, careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten her further, and gently examined her injured arm. The wound was several days old, and showed signs of infection that could become life-threatening without proper treatment. "What's your name?" Mark asked gently as he helped her to her feet. "Aiyana," she replied, leaning heavily against him for support. "It means eternal blossom, but I feel like I'm dying instead of blooming." "Well, Aiyana, my name is Mark Sullivan, and you're not going to die on my watch," he said with quiet conviction. "Let's get you inside where it's warm, and I'll take care of that arm." Inside his simple cabin, Mark worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated battlefield wounds under fire. He cleaned and properly dressed Aiyana's injured arm, administered willow bark tea for the pain and fever, and prepared a simple meal of bread and soup that wouldn't overwhelm her empty stomach. Throughout the process, the girl endured his ministrations with stoic courage, never crying out despite what must have been considerable pain. As Aiyana slowly ate her first real meal in days, her story emerged in fragments that painted a picture of tragedy all too common in the territory's violent landscape. Her family had been part of a small band trying to live peacefully in the remote mountains, avoiding the conflicts that had torn the region apart. 3 weeks ago, a group of white men claiming to be government agents had attacked their camp without warning, killing the adults and scattering the children. "My father tried to protect us," Aiyana said quietly, her dark eyes reflecting pain that went far beyond physical injury. "He told me to run, to hide in the rocks. I heard the shooting, heard my mother scream, but I was too frightened to help them. Mark felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same fury he'd experienced during the war when he'd witnessed unnecessary brutality from both sides. The Apache Wars were officially winding down, but incidents like this continued to plague the territory as various groups tried to force the last free Apache onto reservations through violence and intimidation. "What happened after the attack?" Mark asked gently. "How did you end up here?" "I hid for 2 days, then started walking. Didn't know where to go, just knew I couldn't stay there with the bodies." Her voice broke slightly before she regained control. "Been walking for weeks, living on berries and stream water. When I saw your ranch, I thought maybe someone would help." Mark studied this brave child who'd survived weeks alone in wilderness that challenged experienced frontiersmen, and felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the war, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own survival and comfort. "You were right," he said simply. "I'll help you. You can stay here as long as you need to, until we figure out what comes next." Aiyana's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion beyond wariness that Mark had seen from her. "You would let Apache girl stay in your house?" "Many white men would turn me away, or worse. I judge people by their actions, not their ancestry," Mark replied. "You're a brave young woman who's survived something terrible. That's what matters to me." The first weeks of Aiyana's stay at Mark's ranch passed in a careful dance of mutual adjustment as both learned to navigate their unusual living arrangement. Mark had never had children of his own, and caring for a traumatized Apache teenager presented challenges he hadn't anticipated. Aiyana, despite her maturity and intelligence, was still processing grief and trauma that would have broken many adults. Gradually, however, a routine emerged that worked for both of them. Mark taught Aiyana practical skills like cooking on a wood stove, reading English, and basic arithmetic, while she shared traditional Apache knowledge about desert survival, tracking, and understanding animal behavior. Her keen eyes often spotted things Mark missed: the first signs of sickness in his cattle, the tracks of predators near his chicken coop, the subtle changes in weather that preceded storms. "Your horses are unhappy," Aiyana observed one morning as they worked together to repair a section of fence. "The bay mare especially. She misses having other horses to talk to." Mark paused in his hammering to study his small herd. He'd never thought of horses as needing conversation, but watching them now, he could see the restless behavior Aiyana had noticed. Her understanding of animal psychology was intuitive and remarkably accurate. "What do you think would help?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Wild horses come through this valley sometimes. If you let your horses run with them for a while, they would come back happier. Apache way is to let horses choose their loyalty, rather than force it." As autumn deepened toward winter, Mark found himself marveling at the changes Aiyana's presence brought to his life. The lonely silence that had characterized his evenings was replaced by conversation, questions, and the small daily rhythms of shared domestic life. More importantly, he discovered that teaching and protecting this remarkable young woman gave his life a meaning and purpose that had been missing since the war ended. Aiyana, for her part, seemed to bloom under Mark's patient care and protection. The haunted look gradually faded from her eyes, replaced by curiosity about her new world and genuine affection for the man who'd given her sanctuary. She began to smile more often, to ask questions about white customs and history, and to share stories of her own culture that helped Mark understand the depth and sophistication of Apache society. The first real test of their arrangement came in early November when Mark's nearest neighbor, Tom Bridger, rode over to investigate reports of smoke from Mark's cabin. Bridger was a decent man, but one who'd lost family to Apache raids and held strong opinions about the proper place of Indians in white society. "Heard you had yourself a visitor," Bridger said without dismounting, his eyes scanning the property for signs of the rumored Apache presence. "Folks in town are curious about who you might be harboring out here." Mark stepped onto his porch, positioning himself between Bridger and the cabin where Aiyana waited inside. "Just a young girl who needed help. Nothing that concerns anyone else." "Apache girl?" Bridger pressed, his weathered face showing obvious disapproval. "Mark, you know there's been trouble with hostiles in the area. Harboring one of them, even a child, sends the wrong message to the others. The only message I'm sending is that children deserve protection regardless of their heritage," Mark replied firmly. "She's not a hostile, she's an orphan who's lost everything." The conversation with Bridger marked the beginning of a more complicated phase in Mark and Aiyana's relationship, as word of her presence spread through the scattered ranching community around Cedar Ridge. Some neighbors proved sympathetic to Mark's humanitarian impulses, while others viewed his decision to shelter an Apache child as somewhere between foolish charity and outright treason. The tensions came to a head 3 weeks later when Sheriff Bill Crawford arrived at the ranch accompanied by a federal agent named Harrison Cope. Cope represented the Bureau of Indian Affairs and carried the bureaucratic authority to make decisions about Aiyana's future that neither Mark nor she would have any say in. "Mr. Sullivan," Cope announced with official pomposity, "I'm here to take custody of the Apache girl you've been harboring. She belongs on the reservation where she can receive proper supervision and education." Mark felt his blood pressure rising but kept his voice level. "She's not being harbored, she's being cared for, and she's receiving plenty of education right here." "That's not your decision to make," Cope replied curtly. "All Apache minors are wards of the federal government. I have legal authority to place her in appropriate custody." Aiyana chose that moment to appear in the cabin doorway, her young face composed but her dark eyes reflecting the fear and resignation of someone who'd learned that adults in authority rarely had her best interests at heart. She wore one of the simple dresses Mark had bought for her in town, her hair neatly braided, looking every inch the well-cared-for young woman she'd become. "Sir," she said to Agent Cope with careful politeness, "may I ask, what will happen to me on the reservation?" Cope seemed surprised to be addressed directly by an Apache child, particularly one who spoke fluent English. "You'll be placed in the government school where you'll learn useful skills and proper American values. It's for your own good." "And what about my Apache values?" Aiyana asked with quiet dignity. "What about the things my parents taught me before they were killed?" "Those old ways are dead," Cope replied with bureaucratic bluntness. "Your future lies in assimilation into civilized society." Mark saw the flash of pain and anger that crossed Aiyana's face at the casual dismissal of her heritage, and felt his own temper flare. "Agent Cope, this girl has been through enough trauma without being forcibly separated from the only stable home she's known in months. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your charitable impulses, but you're not qualified to raise an Indian child. The reservation school has experience dealing with these cases. What I have is a home where she's safe, happy, and learning skills that will help her succeed in any world she chooses to enter," Mark replied. "What you're offering is an institution that treats children like prisoners." Sheriff Crawford, who'd remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Bill, what if we try to compromise? The girl seems well cared for here, and Mr. Sullivan has a good reputation in the community. Maybe we could arrange some kind of supervised custody arrangement." Agent Cope's expression suggested he had little patience for compromises that didn't align with federal policy. "The law is clear, Sheriff. All Apache children belong under government supervision. I'm authorized to use force if necessary to ensure compliance." It was then that Aiyana stepped forward with the quiet courage that had enabled her to survive weeks alone in the wilderness. "Mr. Cope, I understand you believe you're acting in my best interests, but I've learned something important living here, that people should be judged by their actions, not their heritage. Mr. Sullivan judged me by my need for help rather than my race. Can you do the same?" The eloquent challenge from a 13-year-old Apache girl clearly caught Agent Cope off guard, forcing him to confront the human reality behind his bureaucratic mission. Sheriff Crawford looked impressed by Aiyana's articulate response, while Mark felt a surge of pride at the courage and wisdom she'd displayed under pressure. "Young lady," Cope said with somewhat less certainty than before, "these decisions are made by people with far more experience than you in determining what's best for your people." "With respect, sir," Aiyana replied, "the people who made those decisions aren't the ones who have to live with the consequences. I've lost my family, my home, and my entire way of life. The only stability I've found is here, with someone who sees me as a person rather than a problem to be managed." The standoff stretched for several uncomfortable minutes as Cope weighed his options. Federal policy was clear, but the situation before him was more complex than his superiors had anticipated. Mark Sullivan was clearly a responsible man providing excellent care. Aiyana was obviously thriving in his custody, and forcing her removal would create exactly the kind of public relations problem that the Bureau preferred to avoid. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," Cope announced finally. "The girl can remain here temporarily while I seek guidance on this unusual situation." After the officials departed, Mark found Aiyana sitting on the porch steps, staring toward the mountains where her people had once lived freely. Despite her brave performance during the confrontation, she looked small and vulnerable in the gathering dusk. "You were magnificent," Mark said, settling beside her. I've seen seasoned politicians with less composure under pressure. My father always said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Aiyana replied quietly. I was terrified they'd drag me away from the only home I have left. They won't, Mark promised, though privately he wasn't sure how he could prevent it if federal authorities insisted on enforcing their policies. Whatever happens, I'll fight for you every step of the way. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected development that would change everything about their situation. Agent Cope's temporary arrangement stretched into months as bureaucratic wheels turned slowly in Washington, leaving Mark and Aiyana in legal limbo but practical freedom to continue their unconventional family life. During this period, Aiyana continued to flourish under Mark's patient guidance. Her English improved dramatically. She learned to read and write with remarkable facility, and she began to bridge her Apache heritage with the practical skills needed to succeed in white society. More importantly, she started to heal emotionally from the trauma of losing her family, finding in Mark the security and affection that allowed her natural personality to emerge. Mark, for his part, discovered that having Aiyana in his life filled a void he hadn't even realized existed. The purpose and meaning that came from protecting and nurturing this remarkable young woman gave his daily routine a significance that extended far beyond mere survival. He began to understand why some men found parenthood so fulfilling, despite its challenges and responsibilities. The peaceful routine was shattered on a cold February morning when riders appeared on the ridge overlooking Mark's ranch. Through his field glasses, Mark counted 8 Apache warriors moving with the purposeful discipline of a military patrol. His first thought was for Aiyana's safety, but when he called for her to come inside, she was already studying the approaching riders with intense concentration. I know them, she said with barely contained excitement. The leader is Nalnish, my uncle, my father's brother. They've been searching for survivors of our band. The reunion between Aiyana and her uncle was emotional and complex, filled with joy at finding family alive but also sadness at the losses they'd both endured. Nalnish proved to be a man in his 40s with the weathered bearing of someone who'd spent his life fighting impossible odds to protect his people. He studied Mark with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, trying to understand why a white rancher would risk his safety to protect an Apache child. My brother's daughter tells me you saved her life when she was dying of hunger and wounds, Nalnish said in careful English. This creates obligations between our families that cannot be easily dismissed. Mark invited the warriors to share a meal while they discussed Aiyana's situation, though he remained acutely aware that 8 armed Apache could easily overwhelm him if they chose violence over negotiation. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear that Nalnish was more interested in understanding than in taking revenge. Why did you help her? Nalnish asked bluntly. Your people and mine have been enemies for many years. Because she needed help, Mark replied simply. I don't judge children by the actions of adults they've never met. Nalnish nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that this answer aligned with his own values despite the cultural differences that separated them. My niece has told me how you care for her, how you teach her useful skills while respecting her Apache heritage. This shows wisdom and honor. As evening fell and the warriors prepared to make camp nearby, Aiyana faced an impossible choice. She could leave with her uncle and return to what remained of her people, living free but constantly hunted in the mountains. Or she could remain with Mark, safe and secure but separated from her heritage and culture. What do you want to do? Mark asked gently, though the question tore at his heart. Over the past months, Aiyana had become the daughter he'd never expected to have, and the thought of losing her was almost unbearable. I want both, Aiyana replied with tears in her eyes. I want my Apache family and my white family. I want to honor my parents' memory while building a future in your world. Why must I choose between the people I love? It was Nalnish who provided an unexpected solution. Perhaps there is another way, he said thoughtfully. Among our people, children sometimes live with relatives other than their parents when circumstances require it. What if my niece remained here during the dangerous times, but visited with us when it is safe? The arrangement they worked out over the next several days was unprecedented in the territory's history. Aiyana would continue living with Mark as his adopted daughter, receiving education and protection in white society, while maintaining her connections to Apache culture through regular visits with her uncle's band. In return, Mark would gain something equally valuable: the protection and friendship of warriors who understood the debt they owed him for saving one of their own. This white man has proven himself worthy of our trust, Nalnish announced to his warriors in a formal ceremony that Mark didn't fully understand but clearly recognized as significant. He is family now, bound to us by honor and the life he saved. Any who threaten him, threaten us. The implications of this declaration became clear over the following weeks, as word spread through the Apache community that Mark Sullivan was under their protection. Raiders who might have targeted his isolated ranch chose easier prey elsewhere, while hostile neighbors found themselves reconsidering their attitudes toward the man who'd somehow earned the respect of former enemies. Agent Cope returned in spring with new orders from Washington, but his mission had been complicated by reports of the unusual arrangement between Mark and the Apache. Federal authorities were uncertain how to handle a situation where their policies were being peacefully circumvented by people who'd found a solution that worked for everyone involved. "Mr. Sullivan," Cope announced with obvious frustration, "I've been instructed to regularize this situation, according to established procedures. The girl must be enrolled in the reservation school system." "Then enroll her," Mark replied calmly, "but let her continue living here and attending the local school as well. She'll get the best of both educational systems." The bureaucratic compromise that emerged satisfied no one completely but allowed everyone to claim partial victory. Aiyana was officially enrolled in the reservation school system, satisfying federal requirements, but was permitted to continue living with Mark under a special cultural preservation program that allowed promising Apache students to maintain connections with white society. The arrangement required monthly visits to the reservation for cultural education and periodic inspections by federal agents, but it also provided Aiyana with unprecedented opportunities to bridge two worlds that had traditionally known only conflict. She became fluent in both English and Apache, comfortable with both traditional crafts and modern academic subjects, equally at home in Mark's ranch house and her uncle's mountain camps. As 1886 progressed into 1887, the partnership between Mark and Aiyana began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Territorial officials noticed that their region was experiencing fewer Apache-related incidents than neighboring areas, while Apache leaders observed that at least one white family was treating their children with respect and genuine care. The first concrete test of their arrangement came in late summer when a gang of rustlers began operating in the area around Cedar Ridge. Led by a notorious outlaw named Jake Morrison, the gang had been systematically stealing cattle from isolated ranches, confident that scattered homesteaders couldn't organize effective resistance against experienced criminals. Mark's ranch should have been a perfect target, remote, lightly defended, and reportedly harboring an Apache girl who could be eliminated as a potential witness. But when Morrison's scouts began surveillance of the property, they discovered something that changed their calculations dramatically. The ranch was under protection that went far beyond anything Mark could have arranged himself. Apache warriors watched from concealed positions on every approach, ready to sound alarms or engage threats as circumstances required. Any attack on Mark's property would trigger retaliation from some of the most skilled fighters in the Southwest. That rancher's got himself some powerful friends, Morrison complained to his lieutenants after their scouts reported the situation. Attacking him would be like kicking a hornet's nest. The gang moved on to easier targets, but their reconnaissance had been observed by the very warriors they'd tried to avoid. Within days, Nalnish arrived at Mark's ranch with information about the rustlers' plans and an offer of assistance that demonstrated the full scope of Apache protection. "These men plan to steal cattle from your neighbors," Nalnish informed Mark during an evening conversation on the ranch house porch. "We cannot allow such criminals to operate freely in territory where our family lives." What followed was a coordinated campaign that combined Apache scouting skills with settler knowledge of local terrain and law enforcement procedures. Mark served as liaison between the Apache warriors and Sheriff Crawford, providing intelligence that allowed lawmen to anticipate the rustlers' movements while avoiding direct confrontation between Apache and white forces. The operation culminated in a perfectly executed trap that netted the entire Morrison gang without a shot being fired. Apache warriors herded the outlaws into a canyon where Sheriff Crawford and his deputies waited with arrest warrants and overwhelming firepower. Morrison and his men found themselves facing a choice between surrender and certain death in a crossfire they couldn't escape. "How did you know exactly where we'd be?" Morrison demanded as handcuffs were applied. "Let's just say I've got good sources of information," Sheriff Crawford replied with a slight smile. The successful operation against the rustlers created a precedent for cooperation between Apache and white law enforcement that would influence territorial politics for years to come. More immediately, it demonstrated to the broader community that Mark's unusual family arrangement brought benefits that extended far beyond his own property. The success of the anti-rustling operation transformed Mark's reputation throughout the territory from eccentric Apache sympathizer to valuable community asset. Ranchers who'd previously viewed his protection of Aiyana with suspicion began to see the practical advantages of having friendly relations with Apache scouts and warriors. Local law enforcement discovered that Apache intelligence networks provided early warning of criminal activity that their own resources couldn't match. Aiyana, now 15 years old and flourishing under her unique educational arrangement, had become a bridge between communities that had known only mistrust and violence. She served as translator during negotiations between Apache leaders and territorial officials, helped resolve misunderstandings that could have escalated into bloodshed, and demonstrated to both cultures that cooperation was possible when people focused on shared interests rather than historical grievances. The arrangement faced its greatest test in the spring of 1888, when a new territorial governor arrived with instructions to resolve the Apache problem through more aggressive enforcement of federal policies. Governor William Hayes was a career politician with ambitions for higher office, and he saw strict adherence to reservation boundaries as essential for attracting the eastern investment that would fuel territorial development. "Mr. Sullivan," Hayes announced during an official visit to Mark's ranch, "I'm here to inform you that your irregular custody arrangement is being terminated. The Apache girl will be transferred to the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where she can receive proper education away from negative tribal influences." Mark felt his blood run cold at the mention of Carlisle, which was notorious for its harsh methods of forced assimilation that separated children from their families and cultures. "Governor, Aiyana is thriving under her current arrangement. She's receiving excellent education while maintaining valuable cultural connections that benefit the entire territory." "Those cultural connections are exactly the problem," Hayes replied curtly. "We need to break the cycle of tribal loyalty that prevents full assimilation into American society." Aiyana, who'd been listening from the kitchen, chose that moment to enter the room with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark in dealing with difficult officials. "Governor Hayes, may I respectfully ask what specific problems my presence here has created?" Hayes seemed taken aback by being directly challenged by an Apache teenager, particularly one who spoke with such articulate confidence. "Young lady, this isn't about problems you've created. It's about implementing policies designed to ensure your successful integration into civilized society." "I see," Aiyana replied thoughtfully. "And how do you define successful integration? Because if it means learning to read, write, and function effectively in white society while maintaining respect for my heritage, then I believe I've already achieved that goal." The governor's discomfort was obvious as he struggled to explain policies that sounded reasonable in Washington but appeared unnecessarily harsh when applied to a well-adjusted, articulate young woman who clearly posed no threat to anyone. "Miss Aiyana," Hayes said finally, "these decisions aren't made arbitrarily. They're based on extensive experience with Indian education and the most effective methods for ensuring successful outcomes." "Governor," Mark interjected, "Aiyana has already demonstrated successful outcomes. She reads at a college level, speaks 3 languages fluently, understands both Apache and white customs, and has helped prevent more conflicts than your policies have resolved." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Crawford, who'd ridden out to warn Mark about developments in town. "Governor, you might want to know that word of your plans has spread through the Apache community. There are reports of warriors gathering in the mountains, and the mood isn't friendly." Hayes's face paled as he realized the implications. "Are you saying they're planning an uprising over one girl?" "I'm saying they view any threat to Aiyana as a threat to their entire relationship with white authority," Crawford replied. "The peace we've enjoyed in this region is built on mutual respect and trust. Destroying that foundation could have consequences that go far beyond education policy." The crisis escalated over the next several days as reports reached Cedar Ridge of Apache warriors massing in the mountains surrounding the valley. Nelnish and other leaders had sent word through traditional channels that any attempt to forcibly remove Aiyana would be considered an act of war against all Apache people. Governor Hayes found himself facing a choice between enforcing federal policy and maintaining the fragile peace that had made his territory a model of successful Indian relations. Mark spent those tense days in consultation with Apache leaders, territorial officials, and anyone else who might help find a solution that avoided bloodshed while protecting Aiyana's future. The young woman herself remained remarkably calm despite being at the center of a controversy that could reshape the entire region's political landscape. "I never wanted to cause so much trouble," Aiyana confided to Mark one evening as they watched the sun set over the mountains where her people waited. "Maybe I should just go to the school in Pennsylvania and end this crisis." "You didn't cause this trouble," Mark replied firmly. "You're just caught in the middle of people who can't see past their own narrow definitions of what's right and wrong." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when a delegation of prominent ranchers and businessmen requested a meeting with Governor Hayes. Led by Tom Bridger, who'd overcome his initial prejudices about Apache to recognize the practical benefits of peace, the group presented a compelling economic argument for maintaining the status quo. "Governor," Bridger explained, "this territory has enjoyed 3 years of unprecedented stability and prosperity since Mark Sullivan's arrangement began. Apache raids have virtually ceased, criminal activity is down, and we've attracted investment because people know it's safe to operate here. Are you suggesting that one girl's education is worth more than consistent application of federal policy?" Hayes demanded. "I'm suggesting that successful policies should be continued rather than abandoned for the sake of bureaucratic uniformity," replied James Morrison, the territory's largest cattle rancher. Aiyana Sullivan, and yes, we all think of her as a Sullivan, now has done more to promote peaceful relations than any government program we've seen. The economic arguments were reinforced by a letter from the War Department acknowledging that the territory's low rate of Apache incidents had allowed military resources to be redirected to more troubled regions. Federal authorities in Washington were reluctant to risk destabilizing a successful model of Indian relations, even if it didn't conform to standard procedures. Governor Hayes found himself in the politically uncomfortable position of choosing between rigid policy enforcement and practical results that reflected well on his administration. The decision was made easier when Nalnish himself requested a meeting to discuss possible compromises that might satisfy everyone's concerns. The conference that took place in Mark's ranch house brought together representatives of 3 different cultures who'd learned to work together despite their historical differences. Nalnish spoke for the Apache people. Governor Hayes represented federal authority, and Mark served as the bridge between worlds that had found common ground in their shared concern for one remarkable young woman. "We do not ask you to change your laws," Nalnish said with the dignity that marked him as a natural leader. "We ask only that you recognize when those laws are working well and should not be changed." "But the federal mandate is clear," Hayes protested. "All Apache children must receive standardized education in approved institutions." "Then approve this institution," Aiyana suggested with the logical directness that had become her trademark. "I'm receiving education that meets or exceeds any standard you might set. Why not use this arrangement as a model for others, rather than destroying something that works?" The solution that emerged satisfied the essential requirements of all parties while creating a precedent that would influence Indian education policy for decades to come. Aiyana's living arrangement with Mark was formalized as an experimental cultural integration program that provided traditional Apache children with exposure to white society while maintaining their cultural connections. The formalization of Aiyana's status as the first participant in the experimental cultural integration program created ripple effects throughout the territorial government and federal Indian policy apparatus. What had begun as an act of simple compassion, Mark's decision to help a dying Apache child had evolved into a model that challenged fundamental assumptions about assimilation, education, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between cultures. Governor Hayes, initially reluctant to embrace the arrangement, discovered that the program brought his administration positive attention from Washington officials impressed by the territory's stability and innovation in Indian affairs. Aiyana became a showcase example of successful integration, frequently called upon to demonstrate her bilingual abilities and cultural knowledge to visiting dignitaries and policymakers. The Apache community, led by Nalnish and other pragmatic leaders, recognized the value of having one of their own positioned to influence white decision-making while maintaining strong tribal connections. Warriors who'd spent years fighting for survival found themselves serving as informal protectors of a ranch that had become a symbol of what was possible when former enemies chose cooperation over conflict. Mark's life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. His modest ranch had become an important diplomatic center, where Apache leaders, territorial officials, and federal representatives met to discuss policies affecting thousands of people. More importantly, his relationship with Aiyana had given him the family he'd never expected to have, and a purpose that extended far beyond his own welfare. The protection arrangement that had developed around Mark's property, proved its value repeatedly over the years that followed. Criminal elements who might have targeted an isolated ranch discovered that attacking Mark Sullivan meant facing retaliation from Apache warriors who treated him as family. Corrupt officials who might have abused their authority found their activities observed and reported by intelligence networks that extended throughout the territory. The most dramatic demonstration of this protection came in 1890, when a group of land speculators attempted to use forged documents and intimidation to force Mark off his property. The scheme might have succeeded against an ordinary rancher, but Mark's situation was far from ordinary. Within hours of the first threatening visit, Apache scouts had identified the speculators' base of operations, while warriors took positions around their camp. The confrontation ended without violence when the would-be thieves woke to find themselves surrounded by painted figures who'd emerged from the desert like spirits of vengeance. No threats were made, no weapons were brandished. The Apache simply made their presence known and waited for the criminals to make the logical choice to abandon their scheme and leave the territory permanently. How did they know to come? Mark asked Nalnish when the war chief appeared at his ranch the next morning to ensure the threat had been properly resolved. Family protects family, Nalnish replied with Apache simplicity. Always watching, always ready. You saved our daughter when she had nothing, gave her home when she was lost. Now she has two families who will defend her and each other. As the 19th century drew to a close, Aiyana had grown into a remarkable young woman whose unique position allowed her to serve as a bridge between communities that continued to struggle with questions of identity, justice, and coexistence. She spoke multiple languages, understood diverse cultures, and possessed the practical skills needed to succeed in any environment she chose to enter. At 18, she made the decision to attend college in Denver, becoming one of the first Apache women to pursue higher education while maintaining her cultural connections and family relationships. Her departure for school was marked by ceremonies from both communities, Apache rituals that honored her journey toward wisdom, and a formal graduation celebration hosted by the white families who'd watched her grow from a frightened refugee into a confident young woman. But even as Aiyana pursued her education in the city, the protection that surrounded Mark's ranch never wavered. Apache warriors continued their invisible watch, ensuring that the man who'd given their daughter sanctuary would always be safe from those who might seek to harm him. The arrangement had evolved from a temporary protection detail into a permanent commitment that would last for the rest of Mark's life. The legend of their partnership spread throughout the Southwest, inspiring other attempts at cross-cultural cooperation and demonstrating that enemies could become family when they chose to see each other's humanity rather than their differences. Mark's ranch became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand how peace could flourish in places where only conflict had existed before. When Aiyana returned from college 4 years later with a degree in education and plans to establish schools that would serve both Apache and white children, she found the ranch exactly as she'd left it, protected, prosperous, and serving as a beacon of hope in a region still struggling with questions of justice and reconciliation. You know, she said to Mark one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I used to think I was the one who needed saving that day you found me by your barn. But I think maybe we saved each other. Mark nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. His rescue of one desperate Apache child had led to connections, purpose, and protection that had transformed not just his own life but the lives of countless others who'd witnessed their example of what was possible when compassion triumphed over prejudice. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the American West, from a battleground into a functioning society, they often overlooked the smaller stories, the individual acts of courage and kindness that created the foundation for larger changes. But in the Apache oral tradition, and in the memories of the families who'd known them, the story of Mark Sullivan and Aiyana lived on as proof that sometimes the greatest victories were won not with guns and cavalry, but with open hearts and the simple recognition that every child deserves protection, regardless of who their people are or where they come from. The ranch itself became a symbol that endured long after both Mark and Aiyana had passed into legend. The invisible warriors who'd protected it for decades gradually gave way to their sons and grandsons, but the commitment never wavered. Generation after generation of Apache warriors maintained their watch, honoring the debt created when one white man chose to see a dying child as someone worth saving, rather than an enemy to be feared. And in the end, that may have been the most remarkable legacy of all, proof that acts of simple human decency could echo across generations, creating bonds of loyalty and protection that lasted far longer than the conflicts that had divided their peoples. In a harsh land that had known too much violence and too little mercy, Mark and Aiyana had created something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most impossible circumstances into hope.